Today we're going to be talking about culture. This is chapter 3, section 1. I recommend that as you are listening to today's lesson that you take notes so that you'll have the information for the check for understanding at the end of this lesson, but also for your notes for your test at the end of this chapter. So really we're going to be talking about what is culture and how do we develop culture. So the first thing you need to think about is how would you define culture? And then think of an example of something that you consider part of your culture. So when I think about culture, if I were to think about American culture, so if I were to think about the culture associated with our country, a few things that come to mind are some specific national holidays like Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Memorial Day, Labor Day. Those are things that are unique to our country, and they deal with our history. And oftentimes, we live in this country together, and a lot of people celebrate those holidays in very similar ways. There might be a little variation here and there. You might not have your traditional Thanksgiving meal, but oftentimes the majority of Americans sit down with their family or even friends that are like family and sit around and partake in a big meal for that holiday. And so that's part of our culture as a country. So what is culture? Culture is the knowledge, values, customs, and physical objects that are shared by members of society. And so in our case, if we go back to our example of our country, knowledge might be things like our common history of our country and how our country was founded. And a lot of times we gain that knowledge through things like public education, where we're taught about our history of our country, the values of our country. So, for example, things as basic as democracy, that could be a value that is widespread throughout our country. Now, we may have different ideas about how to achieve democracy, but overall, it's a pretty consistent value throughout our country. Customs, there are certain things that we do in our country, like if we're greeting somebody, either saying hello because we know them or meeting someone, oftentimes we shake hands. Shaking hands is something that is more unique to the Western world and even specifically to the United States. If you go somewhere in Europe, sometimes greeting somebody involves kissing them on the cheek. If you go to some Asian countries, it might involve bowing and things like that. So that would be a custom. And then physical objects. So physical objects that can represent culture. And again, if we go back to that example of our country as having a common culture, things like the image of the eagle, the Statue of Liberty, the American flag. These are all images or physical objects that represent the culture and are used to easily identify the culture itself of our country. So that was kind of using this next slide is what I was just going over in the previous slide. So what is the purpose of culture? Culture is learned behavior that guides people's relationships with others. And so, if you're here in the United States, you were born in the United States, you understand the culture of our country, it's very easy to kind of move throughout the country and go through day to day, and you don't kind of get strange looks. But if you were to place yourself into another country and into another culture, you may not know kind of what those rituals are, what the symbols are, what the language is, and things like that. And so that could definitely make things more challenging and would make those relationships not quite as close or understood. So how is society, the word society, different from the word culture? So society is different because it is a group of people who live in a defined territory and participate in a common culture. So a defined territory meaning that there are borders. Okay, so for example, again, we can use the example of the United States. There are some defined borders. We know where our country begins and where our country ends. And within those lines, there is even if it's kind of a loose common culture, there is that common culture there. It could also be, a state border. It could be a continent, right? Because it's completely surrounded by water in most cases, or some type of landmark or landscape that separates it from another continent. And so there is some type of defined border between one and another. Okay. So where does this culture come from? Well, like I mentioned before, a lot of it is kind of learned, and it's how we interact with each other. There are some instincts involved in our behavior. Obviously, that may or may not impact our culture, but instincts are genetically inherited patterns of behavior. So if you think to yourself about what are some examples of human instinct, human instinct would be like to eat when you are hungry. That has nothing to do with your culture. All humans are driven to eat when they are hungry, to sleep when they are tired. Okay, that's not unique to one group of people over another group of people. We all have this genetic instinct in us to do certain things. Why is culture more important than instinct in determining human behavior? So like I said before, all humans are going to have a lot of these same instincts that are similar to other people. And humans have the ability to make decisions and not just rely on instinct. So something that makes humans unique compared to many of the other animal species is that we are able to make decisions about what we do, how we interact with people, how do we spend our time. We're able to create new inventions and things like that. And most animals do not have any of those capabilities, or maybe only have one of those capabilities, and maybe they form relationships with other animals within that species or whatever. But the thing that makes us unique is it's not all about instinct. We can choose. We have the ability to, decide how we react to a situation rather than just react because of those instincts. How does heredity affect behavior? So heredity, again, is kind of like the genetic side of things. And so this is where sociologists have to ask themselves, how much of this is nature? So how much of it is just in our genes, the way that we act? And how much of it is nurture? So how much of this has to do with our environment? How much does our environment teach us and how we act and what our behavior is? So I want you to think for a second. If you had to pick one or the other, and you can't say both, if you had to pick nature or nurture, so biology or environment, which one do you think plays a bigger role in deciding how humans behave? So think to yourself for a minute about that. Do you think it's the genes that were passed down to you by your parents that determines your behavior? Or do you think it's the environment you grew up in that has taught you to behave a certain way? So to answer the question, they have done some studies to try to figure out how much of it is nature and how much is nurture. And they've done these studies called twin studies. And oftentimes during these twin studies, they will find children who maybe had been adopted as infants, and oftentimes they would have to have been identical twins, and they would be adopted by different families. And the families obviously would not be exactly the same. And so when the sociologists would identify these identical twins, they would see, okay, how much do they have in common? They did not grow up in the same home, but they have the exact same genetics, because remember, identical twins have the same genetics. And so by looking at that, they have shown that about half of your personality is genetic, and about the other half is the result of your environment. So a lot of these identical twins had a lot of things in common, but they did still have some variation because of the environment they grew up in. Humans naturally have reflexes and drives. So a reflex is an automatic reaction to physical stimulus, like blinking your eyes when something is thrown in your direction. That's just something we do. It's a reflex. or maybe you throw your hands up to try to block something from hitting you. That's a reflex. On the other hand, a drive is an impulse to reduce discomfort. So this is what we're talking about kind of with the instinct. Eating when hungry. You're driven to go eat when you are hungry. You are driven to go sleep when you are tired. Culture can change human responses to reflexes and drives. So for example, in a lot of cultures, men are oftentimes taught that it is inappropriate for them to cry if they are in pain or they are sad. And so they teach these boys at a young age that in their culture that may be an inappropriate response to pain or sadness. And therefore, these boys teach themselves to not respond by crying or showing emotion in certain circumstances. Sociobiology is the study of the biological basis of human behavior. This combines Darwin's theory of natural selection with modern genetics. And sociobiology is a theory that has pretty much overall been discredited. And why do we talk about it still? Well, we talk about it because you need to know what it is. And it does include this Darwin's theory of natural selection, which you see show up a lot in social sciences. And they have explored that, but they do not believe that your biology is the majority of your behavior. They believe there is a mixture of both biology and environment. So how do sociologists view human behavior? The belief that the behaviors that best help people are biologically based and transmitted in the genetic code. So the idea here is basically that society promotes behaviors that will help human species survive. And you can see this, like people who are very affectionate parents and care for their children are kind of helping to continue humans' existence throughout time. Friendship is important to continuing the survival of humans, because if someone needs something, you have somebody there. Reproduction is always going to be vital in the survival of any species, because the species will completely end if there is not a next generation. And then finally, the education of children. By educating children, we hope to advance not only our economy, but our society as a whole, which would then continue to further drive this kind of home about survival of humans. So the criticisms of sociobiology, like I was saying before, is that there's too much variation in societies around the world to explain biological traits. So again, sociobiology has oftentimes been discredited, saying that there's not enough evidence to support this theory. But it is an interesting theory to think about the impact of biology on our behavior.